It is time to return my thoughts are yours for the learnings. So here's the thing about school here. Sometimes you got your good professors and sometimes you got your bad professors. So in school, high school, college, med school, it doesn't really matter what level. There will always be those teachers that I shouldn't say no one likes, but it's not that they're a bad person. It's just they are not as, shall we say, pedagogically inclined to instruct large groups of people at once. Or the way they like to teach is not the way that most people like to learn, or many people at all. Or their slides are disorganized, or they're throwing too much information at people at once, or the way they present info is disorganized. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter how they're disorganized, but there's always going to be those professors that you're like, oh, they're killing me, man, and you can't wait till you get out, you're done with them, and you have a better one again. Well, a good student, you can't really control something like that. You can't control if your professor teaches in the way you like. And as a good student who needs to get where they're going to go no matter what, you have your goals, you can't rely on the professor. So to be able to teach yourself anything, you really need, to be able to teach yourself anything, you just need three things. One, a primary resource, and that doesn't have to be the notes or slides the professor gave you. And two, you need a way to study. That means a study system. And three, a way to test yourself. That means a way to monitor and measure your progress so you know that you're getting better regardless of how good your professor is or how good the teaching is. Before your test, you should know how you're going to do. You should basically know the score you're going to get on a test. And you might be like, how can I possibly know what I'm going to get on a test before I do? And that's, well, you test yourself before they test you. It's pretty obvious when you think about it for a minute, but a lot of people don't do it. So nowadays, you can make practice tests. You can use really good prompts to make sure that your practice tests and questions are to the level, difficulty, and quality and type that you would actually get on your real tests, because AI is really good at making stuff that feels and sounds like other things. So if you just give it a few examples, you give it a detailed prompt, it can make a practice test for you. And then it can grade that test. And then it can tell you what you need to work on. So with having your own primary resource, be it slides, pictures, Google, the more that it's in one place, the better. So if you have an old school textbook, that's great. YouTube videos, Khan Academy, there's plenty of resources to learn something. The catch is you just have to make sure that you're learning all the things that your professor or your teacher wants you to know. Because it's possible you'll use a video to teach yourself something, but your professor or teacher is more interested in something else. And they're going to test you on something more that maybe you didn't even learn about. So you got to make sure that you're figuring out what to teach yourself. If you're watching videos as your first run through some material, you got to look at your original source to make sure that you're on track and you're learning what you need to be doing. But as long as you have your own resource, books, videos, you have your own way of studying and your way of testing yourself, you can teach yourself anything without a professor, without really even going to class. A lot of people aren't disciplined enough to do that, and the structure of a classroom environment keeps you up to speed and clues you in on what you need to be going over. Now, when it comes to having your own study system, you might be saying, well, how do I have a study system? What does that even mean? And that just means whenever you sit down to quote unquote study or focus, you have a regimented way of doing things. You do it the same time every time. Now, you might study a slightly different way depending on the class, but whenever you're studying for that class, you have your system, you know what you need to be doing. For example, how you study chemistry is not going to be the same as how you study anatomy, but if you have a optimized system, in theory, every time you sit down, you should be using the best methods and getting straight to the most effective thing. So an example of a study system would be your process. So when you sit down, what exactly are you doing? Are you copying your notes? Are you going to class taking notes and then just copying them down? That's what that means. Just copying them down over and over until you hopefully memorized your notes. Are you highlighting stuff over and over, highlighting books? Are you paraphrasing, writing things in your own words, making flashcards? Everybody has their go-to thing they like to do. Whatever you do, anything that incorporates two things is going to get you where you're trying to go. So that's active recall and spaced repetition. Pretty much every evidence-based study method is using some form of that. And what we've learned through all these years of research is that pretty much studying, it really comes down to those two things. So, or should I say, rather, that doing those two things is gonna lead to the highest retention. And that just means coming back to the thing you're studying over time, multiple times. That would be, spaced repetition is the opposite of cramming, which we're all familiar with. Just a fancy way of saying putting in the work a little every day. And then active recall, that's where you are getting more into testing yourself. So practice tests use active recall because you're trying to recall information to be able to apply it to answer questions on a test. Flashcards employ active recall because you're actively trying to remember, oh, what is the answer to this? Or what is this associated with? And every time you do that, that strengthens a connection in your brain. So some people like to do this thing called mind mapping or concept mapping, you might have heard of, where they'll throw up a bunch of their terms and connect them through with lines and maybe have some notes around those. And what they're really doing when they're doing that is simulating how we think learning works in the brain. So the brain is basically like a nodal network, and everything you learn creates a data point or a node in that network. And what learning is really doing is making connections between nodes. So when you realize that, you can take, if you like to do mind concept mapping, you can take that to a whole new level by actually focusing on not just the points, facts, but the connections between concepts. So learning how something relates to something else is going to help you learn those two things way better than just memorizing them separately. And although that sounds like it's more work, which it is, it makes memorizing the things easier and recalling them way easier. The reason being that nothing is stored in your brain in memorized boxes. Maybe short-term memory it is, but medium to long-term memory, which is where you want to move stuff if you're learning it, in theory, to that mid-term memory. You're going to want to make as many connections between concepts as possible before your test. So one way to leverage this is just using prior knowledge. So even if you've never heard of something before, you know something that it's related to or that it comes from. For example, maybe you're taking a physics class and you don't know anything about optics, but you do remember from high school science class the electromagnetic spectrum and the light prism and how light moves through a prism, and you can go to that place, so to speak, in your memory and start to build your new knowledge from there. The biggest predictor of success in something, one of the biggest predictors, is prior knowledge. So if you don't have a lot of prior knowledge in something, that's okay. You can simulate prior knowledge by connecting what you're now learning to something that you already knew. And it doesn't really matter what that is, as long as the connection makes sense to you. This might sound a little unusual or weird, but if you take the time to do this mind mapping or concept mapping, focusing on the connections, not just the stuff you're writing out trying to memorize, it's going to take you a whole lot farther. Simply because you are training the brain on what connections to make and where and how, in a way that it does naturally already, no matter what. It's just how the brain works. So if you do mind mapping a lot, you might find yourself sitting down to take your test and remembering something based on where it was on your map. You'll just remember it. You'll be able to even picture it in your head. If that's something you do a lot. That's not my primary method of study, simply because I think it's a little more time consuming, and I think there's just faster methods. But for people that are easily distractible, even if you have ADHD, if you're the kind of person that you're not high structure builder, what I mean by that is when you learn new info, your brain just keeps it in a pile and doesn't know what to do with it. A high structure builder would be someone that whenever they go to class, their brain just knows where to put all the stuff they learned and store it. And most people don't need to do as much work on the front end. But everyone can benefit from organizing information when you learn it, before you're going to learn it, during your learning of it, and after the learning event, after class. It doesn't matter when, but organizing info is a great way to maximize retention. So our brains have not been designed to learn things so much as forget them. And you might not have thought of it that way before, but we all kind of know this. If you're not even thinking about, have you ever been lost in thought while you're driving like I'm doing now? Some people, they get to their destination and they don't remember how they got there because they're that lost in thought. Sometimes, if you ask a lot of people, what'd you eat for breakfast? Some people, they can tell you. They have to think about it. Our brains are just really good at forgetting stuff. So things that we see as mundane or useless, your brain deletes it as quickly as possible. And to store information and make room for things that are important, your brain's constantly deleting things. It's deleting files. It's like if you ever had a computer that was really old, eventually you get to the point where you just have to start deleting stuff to keep it. It gets too slow, really. It gets too full, it gets too slow. To learn anything else, it has to delete stuff. And that's what your brain does. So by deleting things, it can speed up the process, make room for more things. Sleep is part of this process. But the best way to forget something is to not sleep. So sleep is probably the most important thing for learning, but that's another story. But when it comes to forgetting things, it's called pruning. So your brain's always pruning off old stuff. Now, there was a scientist who basically realized this and measured it and charted it on a graph, and that figure is named after him. It's called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve, because Dr. Ebbinghaus figured out that we forget things at a pretty predictable rate, particularly things we're taught in a school setting. So academic lessons, your brain is not really prepared for memorizing tons of info that you get in a classroom setting at once, and just imagine and just all of a sudden believing that all of that is important and saving all of it and storing it. So you have to practice this, and you have to practice it against your instincts. But the only way to tell your brain that something's important, it's not to bang your forehead onto the textbook and bang your head against a wall or drill it in. If you ever try to hang something in drywall, so if you screw something in without an anchor, that thing will probably fall out. So if you just hang up something with a screw right into drywall and it's really heavy, if it's not into the stud, then the screw is not going to hold it in there. The picture will rip it off the wall. But you can hang things in drywall with anchors. So prior knowledge in this analogy is like the anchor. drilling things in over and over again, over screwing or over drilling, and with analogy. If you just memorize something and you're doing it over and over again in one sitting, that can work. However, you're likely to forget most of it very quickly because you tricked yourself into thinking you memorized it, but you actually just had it, you were actually just exercising your short-term memory. You have to do that exercise multiple times spaced out for it to stay more permanent. Everyone varies on the spectrum of this, but some people are better at memorizing things, some people are not as good. But these principles apply to everyone, no matter how smart they are. But yeah, when it comes to forgetting things, the only way to remember them is to cue to your brain that that thing is important. Do not forget that thing. And the only way to do that is by revisiting that information multiple times over time. Every time you do that, the rate at which you forget it slows down. So something that you would normally forget in 24 hours, if you study it within 24 hours, you might remember it for another 2 days. And then after a couple days, you study it again. And then you wouldn't forget that for 3 days, and so on. So basically just the longer you can go. So the more reps you get, the longer phase between reps you can manage. So there's apps for this that do it automatically and learn how good you are at memorizing a certain thing and will do all this automatically. Everybody's probably used Quizlet, but something really popular, everybody's probably used Quizlet, but something that's really popular in the academic world is Anki. So, the medical school world is Anki. And Anki is just an app that you can make flashcards with. It's kind of got a learning curve, and it learns you, and it knows how fast you forget stuff. And it can predict when you're going to forget something and show it to you on that day. So by using Anki every day, it gets to know you and makes it a really valuable tool when you're trying to memorize a lot of information as quickly as possible. Now, to efficiently memorize a lot of info as quick as possible, just studying 12 hours straight, that's probably gonna be kind of overkill. So after a certain point for everyone, the brain is kind of done, and that's usually about 4-hour mark. Some people it's less, some people it's more. You're probably thinking it's more for you, but it's shorter than you think. If you're somebody who likes to cram and wait till the last minute and then study for 8 hours straight, about half of those were probably truly productive, believe it or not. So the best thing to do is just figure out, well, how many hours in a day am I actually probably good for? And once you hit that mark, stop and just wait and come back the next day. The discipline to not overstudy is just as hard for a lot of people, if not harder than the discipline to study in the first place. But the brains are designed for efficiency, which means we're better at forgetting things and remembering them. By keeping that in mind, you can get really good at training your brain to remember and recognize what's important by showing it to your brain multiple times over time, not just cramming it over and over and over in one sitting. That's called rote memorization. And rote memorization is not the most efficient way to learn something, and not the best way for that thing to make connections to other things, which is what you need to do when you're answering multiple choice questions and application questions on tests. I mentioned at the beginning of this 3 things that you need to teach yourself anything, the third one being a way to test yourself, and I recommended AI as a good tool to look into. Of course, if you're provided practice questions or tests, use those first. But the reason for that is pro athletes practice like they play. So every good team, they don't just do drills all the time. They have scrimmages and they play themselves. They challenge themselves and they try to play or practice under simulated conditions. And school should be like that too. So a lot of us, we just try to memorize our notes and then go to the test with our fingers crossed and hope for the best. Well, that's not the smartest thing to do. especially if it hasn't worked great for you in the past. They say the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. If that's true, I don't believe that's the definition of insanity, but if it was, then about, I should say 99% of students would be considered insane, because we all do the same thing and hope to get better. But the reality is, if you're testing yourself, you are practicing like you play. So when you go down to sit the test, one, it's a lot less nerve-wracking. Two, a lot of the questions might even seem familiar, or you've seen them before, if you did enough practice questions. There's only so many things you can be asked about for a topic. And when you practice like you play, you're more able to predict your success. So I highly recommend you do those things. One, pick a primary resource so you don't get distracted. Two, have your own study system, one that has active recall and spaced repetition in it. I hope some of those analogies and concepts and ways of thinking helped. And three, having a way to test yourself. So basically using ChatGPT to test your progress on your learning a certain topic and seeing how you're doing. If you do those things, it's really hard to, if not impossible, to fail. So when you do get something wrong, you know what it was and why when you're studying. You identify gaps in your knowledge early and double down on those instead of leaving gaps unmet. I hope this helped. If you are trying to get in medical school and you want one-on-one guidance, expert advice, I have created a course, and that course is available for you. If you're trying to get in medical school and want to know how, I have some materials for you in the description. I wrote a workbook, an ebook on this guide of how to get into medical school and apply and be prepared to apply. And I wrote another one on a study system. If you want a study system like the one I mentioned, or some tips on getting started on creating your own study system, click that link and it'll take you to those books, and I can email them to you. Peace.